Hi, everyone. I'm Alexie Harper, and I'm the co-founder and chief academic officer at Quantic. Welcome to our first ever Women Who Lead virtual summit. This week's events, which are spread out over the next 5 days, are designed to inspire you, teach you, and to spark conversation around the topics of women in leadership. Leading the way will be many of your Quantic peers and alumni. Judging by the over 3,000 session signups, we expect that this week will be powerfully engaging for the Quantic community. And before we get into today's keynote, which will jumpstart our week, allow me to share the structure of today's event. We will first hear from Elizabeth Yin here with us, who you'll meet in a moment. Then we'll have time for questions and answers, so please feel free to submit questions that come to mind. Our team and Elizabeth will do our best to get as many questions answered as possible in the time that we have. Now let's meet Elizabeth. Elizabeth Yin is a co-founder and general partner at Hustle Fund, a pre-seed fund for software entrepreneurs. Previously, she was a partner at 500 Startups, where she invested in seed stage companies and ran the Mountain View Accelerator. In a prior life, she co-founded and ran an ad tech company called LaunchBit. She has a Bachelor of Science in Engineering from Stanford and an MBA from MIT Sloan. Elizabeth has reviewed over 20,000 pitches from around the world in the last few years and has helped numerous portfolio founders raise hundreds of millions of dollars. Her work and writing on startup fundraising has been featured in numerous publications, including TechCrunch, Forbes, and more. Elizabeth, we thank you for joining us and are thrilled to have you help us kick off a very special week. So let's get started. Elizabeth, over to you.
Thank you, Alexie. I'm very honored and excited to be here today in this virtual world. And actually, I'm going to keep this speech quite short because I know that many of you have a number of things whirling through your heads about your journeys, and I would love to dive into your questions. So I'm going to talk in the next few minutes about finding your mission. So what does that actually mean? I think to me, it means, what do you want the world to look like if you're successful in, say, the next 30 years? For me, my mission is to democratize wealth through entrepreneurship, which I'll talk a little bit more about what that actually means in a couple of moments. But first, I'll tell you a little bit more about my entrepreneurship journey that Alexie alluded to. You know, in late 2008, I was working at Google. I had a nice cushy job. And some of you may remember, or maybe you didn't know, I'm not sure the age demographics here, but in late 2008, it was not a really pretty time. We were going through a really harsh recession. And that was not really a great time to be thinking about quitting your nice job, but I did anyway. And I decided that Google was way too big. It's even bigger now, as you all know. And I decided that I really wanted to try my hand at starting a business. I really had no idea what I was doing. I didn't know how to hire people. I didn't know anything about customer acquisition. And I certainly could not fundraise to save my life. I think that was just a hard time in general to be fundraising, but I also didn't really know how to fundraise. And so for the next couple of years, I really meandered and tried to figure things out along the way. And I was only able to raise a little bit of money 3 years later. And I ended up building out essentially an ad network for email called LaunchBit. And later, many years later, it was acquired by a company that is on the East Coast that's a much larger ad network. And along the way, though, I did notice some things. You know, in my fundraising journey, for example, I was often surprised by some of the interactions that I had. Some of these interactions were very new to me that I had not experienced in any past jobs or in school before. It was a little bit shocking, actually. I'll tell you a couple of anecdotes. This one time I was in a Starbucks pitching an investor, actually near the Google headquarters. And I talked about my business with him. And at the end, he asked me, or rather I asked him, so what do you think? And he said, I don't want to say the wrong thing and call you a meek Asian woman, but I question how you'll lead a team of 100 people. And my head was just swirling at that point. I wasn't even sure if I had heard him correctly, but I did. And I also wasn't really sure how do you respond to that, because that was the first time I had ever heard anything along those lines before. That was not the only story that I have. Another anecdote that actually was not an insult or whatnot, but was just part of the process of fundraising, was when I went to pitch a very large VC on Sand Hill Road. And I had made it all the way to the final partner meeting, where they had 7 partners in this meeting. I believe that 5 of them were there in person and 2 of them were virtual, not on Zoom, because at that time, remember, we didn't quite have the same level of technology, but on some much older video conferencing system that was a little bit sporadic. So there I was pitching these 7 men, and all of a sudden it turned into basically this shouting match. And the reason why I mentioned they're men is that all of these investors actually had large booming voices that were much, audibly large, like bigger than mine. And so I went from talking to all of a sudden this whole group of people started talking over me and over each other. And I walked out of that meeting realizing that there was no way I had gotten the investment because I couldn't even hear myself. And, fast forward many years later, after my company was acquired and I was doing some self-reflection and eventually thinking about, is there another business I wanted to start? I kind of came to the realization that whatever I did next, I wanted it to be my life's work, something that I could work on and solve this problem for the next 30 or more years, if I happen to have the luxury and fortune to be around that long. And ads are not my life's work, but something else must be. And I really racked my brains when it dawned on me that from all of these experiences and from having heard so many other founders' experiences, that actually my mission was sitting right in front of me the whole time, which was, how do you make the world more fair? Great founders, as we all know, look like anyone and come from literally everywhere. But resources are not allocated really very well or fairly globally. And so I think that one of the things that we are trying to do at Hustle Fund is to further, you could say, knowledge, networks, and capital to truly the best entrepreneurs, regardless of what they look like, where they come from, and whatnot. And for me, so far in my 4-year journey, but hopefully with many more years to come, we have a lot of work ahead of us, but I'm really proud of some of the initial things that we've been able to do. And, I hope that you too will also find your mission as you think through your journey, as you go through Quantic and your experiences here. Think about what is something that you really want to solve and go after. And I encourage you to do so. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. And I have a few questions to start things off, and then we'll kind of allow some other questions, which I think are coming in now. But I wanted to start with, you've kind of talked to us a little bit about, as a female founder of multiple successful companies and being in these male-dominated spaces, what type of advice would you give other female founders in similar situations?
Gosh, this is really hard. I think that there are a number of situations, that are actually just, honestly, the only thing you can do, it's ingrained structurally and you just have to kind of make the best of it. But so an example of that is the all partner meeting that I kind of mentioned. I cannot change the process of another VC. You just make the most of the situation, you roll with the punches. But I would say that as you start kind of moving up in this ladder, if you will, even if you're still running your startup, I don't think it necessarily requires an exit of sorts. But eventually, you go from sort of this small startup idea or whatever it is you're working on, and you start to get some stature and clout in whatever industry you're in. And then I think that allows you to have a microphone. And with that microphone, I would really encourage people to speak out on things that you think need changing. So for example, in this particular case with the all partner meeting, I really don't think that that is a great way to run a VC process. We certainly don't run our process in that way. And, I think that I'm fairly vocal also about many things about the VC industry as well. And that's something I'll continue to do. And I hope that you all will do something similar with whatever industry you're in.
And kind of just, talking about changes that you've made in reaction to things that you've experienced, what are some things that policies or other things at your company that you've instituted to try to, be the change that you want to see?
Yeah. I would preface with, we still have a long ways to go, but there are a couple of things that, and again, many of these things are very structural or tactical, but, a couple of things that we have done that I think have made a huge difference. Number one, we ask everybody who applies to Hustle Fund to go through the same process, namely apply on our website with this form that is on our website, and everybody goes through that process, whether you're my best friend or whether you're somebody we don't know. Somebody halfway around the world who has zero connection to us can just fill out that form and their application will get treated in the same way. If you're my best friend and you email me and you're like, hey, here's my pitch deck and want to know like if you guys are in or whatever, I will ask you actually to apply through that. We want everybody to be looked at in the same way. I think the second thing is we do a lot of our qualifications without even, quote, looking at the person. So what I mean by that is once you do apply, we look at the application primarily for the idea. Actually, we don't look up the founders. And so if we are, not even going to invest because of ABC reasons regarding the idea, we send out automatic emails right away before we even meet, hear the founder to try to remove some of that bias. Obviously, eventually there is some bias that is introduced when we do actually meet the founders, but we like to keep things as level of a playing field as we can from the get-go.
Thank you. And I have one more question, and then I'm going to turn to all the great questions that are coming in from our audience. So Quantic's mission is to democratize education. And for the Hustle Fund, you're democratizing startup investments. And what other domains of society do you see a need for democratizing opportunity?
Oh, wow. So many. So I think that, my purview is a lot in investing. So we are trying to do that with startups, but we've invested actually in a number of companies that are trying to do something similar in other industries. So for example, there are actually a number of companies now, but we're investors in a company called Fintour and Ludus who are trying to democratize real estate investing, where, most people, if you want to invest in real estate, maybe you buy a REIT or maybe, if you have a lot of money, then you can actually buy property. But most people don't actually have enough money to buy property in a diversified way. So what these kinds of companies are doing is they're fractionalizing a whole bunch of different properties. So you can actually pick what properties you do want to buy into, but you don't need like $100,000 to get started or something. You can just buy however many of those fractions as you want. We also have a company in wine that's trying to do that for wine investing. And we've got a couple more that are a little bit more stealth in equities and crypto as well. But you can imagine similar concept, like a lot of categories that you invest in, you generally need a lot of money, whether it's an angel investor in startups or other things. How can you reduce that friction and that bar?
Great, thank you. And I want to turn to some of the questions that are coming in. And so maybe to start with, what made you so sure of your entrepreneurship with so many uncertainties ahead of you after you left Google? How do you build the right co-founding team?
Oh, that's hard. So I think with regard to finding a co-founder, it is really hard because you are connected to this person for a long time. It really is like a marriage. So I do get a little bit nervous, I suppose, as an investor when people just, pair up together, never having worked with each other before. I think, the reality is that you don't necessarily know the person who's going to be your co-founder for years. So there, to some extent, there are newer relationships, but I would encourage everybody to test that out as soon as possible. Start working together with somebody who may be a potential co-founder, and just like set expectations that is very loose. People can go their separate ways at any point in time. There's nothing formalized, no economics until this actually becomes a thing. Don't incorporate the company yet. And then once you've started working together and you're like, oh, this seems like a good fit, then formalize everything, but set the expectation that's going to be informal first and then go formalize. So you may end up doing some work that may not go anywhere with a person you may not end up working with. And that's fine, but just go in with that mindset.
That's really good advice. And to kind of go in a different direction, how do you overcome feelings of imposter syndrome?
Oh, that's hard. That is really hard. I mean, I think I still have that for sure, but I think I take a lot of inspiration from some of the people around me where it's like, I guess I'm now at the point in age in my life where a number of my peers, whom I've known for a while now, have found a certain level of success. Actually, my business partner and friend's company just went IPO on Thursday. And so it's like so cool to see them on the billboard. And you think like, oh, wow, I'm so proud and excited for them. It also makes you feel like, well, they're my peers and, I feel like I can hang out with them as well. And so, maybe that's something that I could do too. I've never rung the bell at an IPO, but maybe someday. Never say never.
Yeah. And let's see. How do you solve a problem if you don't have the skills to solve it, just the idea for a solution?
I think that a lot of problems can be broken down more simply. So I think and I'm assuming this is related to a business idea of sorts. Like if you have a business idea, I would try to figure out what needs to be de-risked the most. Like what is the riskiest parts of your business? And literally maybe you make a short list of this. Obviously there are a lot of risks, but like what are the top 3? And then I would try to figure out what is the simplest way that I can de-risk that. And so for example, I think a lot of people think, oh, well, I need a technical co-founder to build out this product. But really the biggest risk might be, well, how can I get customers? So how can you kind of shortcut that? Like maybe it's you go in like manually call up all these people and, try to make the sell or try to get them to sign up for a trial or a wait list or something, even if you don't have that. And so I'm just kind of projecting out a couple of things, but like, that's how I would probably try to approach this problem. Like I think most people try to solve for too much or build out too much. And you may not need to do that right out the gates.
And there's a question about developing oneself as a female leader. So what are some techniques or plans that someone might put in place to develop themselves, develop their leadership capabilities? And then what's the role in bringing in male allies?
I think this is a hard question for a couple of reasons, because my purview is like in developing myself as a leader of my organizations, whether it's at Hustle Fund or my past startup. So in some sense, like I had the luxury of a blank slate. I didn't have any baggage that kind of comes with being in the industry. It's funny, like sometimes when I go to VC events, it's like, oh, wow, this is so bro, everyone is so bro, but that's not how it's like at Hustle Fund at all, because like this is the culture and the environment that I've created. And so at Hustle Fund, I feel like, gosh, I don't feel like I have to change the atmosphere here. But if I were working for someone else, let's say I were to work at a different VC fund, then I might think, oh gosh, like, this place is so bro, like how do I establish myself as a female leader there? And I think those are two very different situations. And I think that To some extent, one of the reasons why I have kind of paved my own path is I have just found that to be a lot easier to build out the culture that I've wanted, rather than to try to combat an existing culture that is there. So I don't think I have particularly great advice on the latter.
Let's see. So I have another question that came in. Sometimes it feels like a crime to be young, a woman in South Asian, trying to start a business and set out on your own. How do I best deal with the voices that may hold all of those things against me, against my skills and against my business?
So one thing that actually I would really encourage everybody in this room, regardless of who you are, to think about is like, don't let those sabotaging voices affect you to the extent possible. I know we all have them, but it actually is not helpful for you to think, oh gosh, it's really hard for me to raise money because I'm a woman. I think building a business in general is really hard, just in general, regardless of who you are. It may be a bit harder depending on your demographics, but you shouldn't introduce the sabotaging voices to make it harder for yourself. So I think that the attitude, and I think attitude is really important. So my recommendation here is like, I don't know what any and all of you need to do to remove those sabotaging voices, but maybe it's hanging out with people who are very motivating and inspirational and positive, who can encourage you. Morale is a big thing that you need to control as an entrepreneur, and whatever it takes to help you control that morale, surrounding yourself with better people or whatever it is, that's what I would do as the first step, because you need to go into every situation with a positive mind, even if the cards are stacked against you. You go into fundraising, even if the cards are stacked, like fundraising is just hard for everybody in general, and maybe more hard for other people, but you got to go in thinking positively. You're going to get 90% rejections regardless of who you are, but you have to go in with a positive attitude every single time. Otherwise, it's, those sabotaging voices are going to make your process a lot harder than it already is.
I definitely agree with that founding a company is hard, kind of regardless of who you are. And just thinking about people who are looking for funding, what are some tips that you can give as far as preparing yourself to get funding wherever that may be coming from?
Yeah. Oh, so many tips. I think fundraising is a weird beast that I didn't really understand. Like, it really is about running a process. You need to be meeting with lots of investors, like 100 at the seed stage. Like, you should go in with that mindset. And also to raise a fund, like we met with over 700 investors for our fund one. That's like the kind of work we're talking about for fundraising. Like, you should just think in your mind, I'm going to be doing hundreds of meetings, rather than, oh my gosh, I got 20 rejections in a row. Well, you need to meet at least another 80 people. So that's thought number one. It's a numbers game. Thought number two is like, you want to pack people in so that they prioritize you. So you're talking with a lot of people and nobody's committed yet, but you can at least say, hey, I think I don't know when I'm going to be done raising this round, but we are talking with 20 people a week. And that will help you get prioritized, because people's time is valuable and they're meeting with a lot of other people they could be investing in. Why you? And it's because you are meeting with lots of people. So that's the second thing. And then, just the last thing is getting feedback and really trying to read the room as much as you can to iterate on your pitch. I think one of the reasons why it takes a lot of time to raise money is initially your pitch is going to be pretty bad. Like, you don't know what your story is that will resonate with investors. But if you start hearing things like, this is too crowded, or you don't have any traction, or you whatever, then you can iterate. And maybe iterating means you need to pause until you address some of those things. Or maybe iterating means to change the story, like, okay, just reframe something. And you still have the same business, but reframe things, and maybe that goes a lot better. And so we did 20 decks for Hustle Fund 1. Our initial deck story was terrible. And then by version 20, which was like totally different, we're still the same fund. We still do the same thing, but just the framing was very different. So that's my advice on that.
And what's the process look like when you're kind of going to all of these investors, you're hearing their feedback and you're changing your pitch? Like, tell us a little bit about how that, what were the conversations like with, your co-founders and others at your company? How did you work on that evolution, I guess?
Yeah, I think part of it also is just in not being afraid to ask for feedback. So very often investors will, ghost or walk away without telling you what they really think. But I think it is helpful actually to ask, even just pretty politely, like, hey, it would be really helpful if you don't mind, sharing your thoughts on why you're passing. And then they'll give you maybe a nugget or two. And then if you hear that same nugget or two from, call it a couple or a handful of people, then maybe think about, all right, there's something we need to change. So I'll give you an example for our raise for Hustle Fund One. Initially our story was basically like, here we are. We have a lot of experience. We're both successful entrepreneurs and, have done some investing before. And these are our fancy logos and we invest at pre-seed. Great. And the feedback we got was, okay, well, you and everyone else, there are like hundreds of funds and now probably thousands or tens of thousands of funds out there pitching. You all sound the same. You're not differentiated. Everybody has like started a company. Everybody has done a few angel investments and everybody is now raising a fund. And so it's like, okay, all right, fair point. It's not a differentiated story. So what can we say that is different? And so we start talking a little bit about our model and how we commit in 48 hours, a 25K check, and like all this stuff. Like sometimes our story angle is a bit different where it's like, because of our model, we give, we give people a fair shake. And this is why we have this diversity in our portfolio, et cetera. And depending on who we're talking to, we'll try to pick a story that we think will resonate with the person, on the other end. So you kind of iterate as you go along based on what you hear. And if people don't tell you stuff, then ask for it.
We have a few good questions actually that kind of naturally follow what you were just talking about. So how do you take equity, diversity, and inclusion into consideration? As a fund, do you have a funding stream that supports female-led companies? And what type of sectors are you seeing as a result of the choices you are making?
We're fairly generalist, and I use that word quite loosely in all senses of the word. So generalists on industry. We don't have a diversity mandate, but our portfolio is 30% of our portfolio companies are led by female founders, ranges between 15 and 20% by underrepresented minority founders, Black and Latinx. Geography, we've kind of hovered a bit around 30% are in Silicon Valley and the remaining 70% are rest worldwide. And so I think that our process helps a lot with diversity. We don't have a specific mandate, and industry-wise, we're just kind of all over the place. I would say though that there are certain sectors that we don't do that I think just don't quite fit our fund size, whatever you want to call it. Like for example, we don't really do consumer. Like we would miss out on an Instagram. We can't, with a 25K check, we can't really wait for an ad revenue model to kick in. So that's just, not going to work. And likewise, capital intensive businesses, we also cannot invest in as a result. So your fund size is your strategy. And I think the kinds of things you invest in though, but agnostic to pretty much everything else.
Another question kind of along the same lines. Often the single biggest determinant for who or what gets funded seems not necessarily to be gender, but education and pedigree determined. Even the language of pitching isn't always accessible to most. How do you overcome this?
100% agree. And this is why I mentioned earlier, like we feel like how you set up your process matters. Let's say a friend of mine, may be very well networked and may have this amazing resume, et cetera. That friend inherently is going to, get a lot of first calls very quickly from a lot of VCs. somebody who isn't well networked and doesn't have that kind of resume is going to have a really hard time even just getting meetings. But that being said, I do think that regardless of who you are, you can make it happen for yourself because there's now a lot of information out there. And this is one reason why I blog a lot. So one tip is read my blog because I think that these days there are a lot of great ways to network, regardless of who you are, even on places like Twitter. Like you can have a conversation with pretty much any VC you want on Twitter to try to kind of work your way in, even if you don't have that. Like a founder we invested in, whom we actually outreach to, and normally we don't, like he basically started like tweeting a little bit, openly about how he was running his business. And on Twitter, people can be like, oh, wow, yeah, that person is really smart and thinking about things in a great way. And like, I like how they think about how they're running their business. And that helps a lot. Like, even if you don't have a lot of followers, once you get on the radar of a VC, of course, they're going to research about you at some point, right? And that's what they'll see. I mean, it works the other way too. If you're like, bad mouthing people on Twitter, they'll see that too. But like, put out content and you don't have to spend a lot of time on it. But I think that is a great way to network if you don't have a network or there's logos.
And how do you value a startup that has a great idea, but is still pre-revenue?
Yeah, so for us, and I don't speak for other VCs, but for us, I think there are a couple of things that are really critical because almost all the investments that we do are pre-revenue. So one thing is around competition. So we do tend to shy away from very competitive areas. Now, the flip side is, unfortunately, as an entrepreneur, it's really hard to know whether you're in a competitive area because you don't really know who else is doing stuff. But that is something you will probably hear as feedback fairly early on. And this is why I say your pitch has to be an iterative process. And the reason why obviously in this day and age with the internet being so big and markets being so big, it's not that I don't believe there can be many winners. I definitely think there can be. But here's the thing, like in competitive areas, your customer acquisition costs go up. Your CAC will go up because there are other people who are essentially crowding out the channels. Ad channels are certainly the easiest to understand. Like literally the prices get bid up. But even in other channels like outbound email or content, now you are battling it out with other companies for, mind share, whatever you want to call it, or time. And so that's a big thing for us. So we like very differentiated spaces, and we kind of assess that kind of based on the other applications that we're receiving.
And another question about Hustle Fund in particular, how do candidates stand out when applying on Hustle Fund? And how can you stand out if you're in a market that hasn't had much development in the tech space, for example, lawn care and landscaping?
It's a good question. So I guess when you apply on our when you apply on our site, like if you are there's a place where you can upload your deck. So I think certainly with your deck, if you can make it fairly concise and there are a lot of blogs that talk about how to do a good deck. Like I would definitely follow some of those. I mean, I think that's fairly low hanging fruit, but a lot of people, I don't know, a lot of people do just upload junk. So that's sort of one filter, just putting in sort of the work for that. And it's not just for us, you're going to need that deck for pretty much everybody. And then I think really articulating the problem well. Like this is actually something that is near and dear to my heart, where it's like people tend to have a perfunctory idea of what the actual problem is. And that is, I think, challenging to get behind. Like we want people to, even if they haven't sold anything, to have a really crisp understanding of what the problem is that they're solving specifically. And that kind of differentiates from the rest of the pack.
And as you're kind of speaking and talking about developing your pitch, I was curious. So you earned your MBA from MIT Sloan. Looking back on that experience, what would you say are some of the things that really stood out about your educational experience, getting your MBA? What are some things, what are some reasons why you think an MBA is a helpful degree to have?
I it's an interesting question. So, I mean, I think truthfully, I ended up at MIT in part because I got fired from my job. um, so I don't actually. I realize everybody here is in the MBA program, but so I would just say, like, I don't think that it is necessary to get an MBA to be successful. That being said, how can you make the most of your MBA? I mean, I think things that I would emphasize that I learned, well, one, definitely to the extent possible, like just meet everybody. Like you're in this school and, you know, even if it's virtual, like take the time to meet everybody. That is like connections are a very powerful thing. You don't necessarily know how it will play out, but it will. And then the second thing is around, you know, I think at MIT, like for me, per my interests, I spent a lot of time doing a lot of the entrepreneurship classes and projects, and that was like a big thing for me. And you know, I'm a big believer that like doing things is a lot. It's a good way to learn compared to just reading about them. So I think to the extent where you do have the opportunity to work with classmates, even if it's on a project for a class or whatever in entrepreneurial things, especially in this day and age, I would highly recommend that.
You talked a little bit about meeting everyone in your year. How has it been helpful having that network of business school classmates, you know, after graduation?
Yeah, well, I think right after graduation, it's a little bit hard to say, oh, you know, these people will be useful or whatever. You just don't really know. But now I'm what, more than 10 years out, like 14 years out. And a lot of my classmates have gone on to do phenomenal things. And, you know, some of them have even become investors in my fund, which has been incredibly helpful. Um, and, you know, some of them have been incredibly helpful just in general in the startup community, or have joined our squad, our Angel Squad program. And so like, you just don't really know like what opportunities will show up to be able to work together. And I think that ultimately, you know, business school in particular is an interesting signal where everybody goes because they want to network, because they want to potentially work together someday. Even if that isn't fully fleshed out, that is a positive signal where everybody there is literally looking to do that. And so I would take advantage of that opportunity. You won't know where it will lead to in 10 years, but I have high confidence that it will lead somewhere just because of that signal in itself.
What are some of the soft skills that are important to develop as an entrepreneur and company leader?
I think management is so hard, people management. And, you know, I think that when I was first starting my company, I was a very terrible people manager. I think most people start out as pretty bad people managers in the beginning. So a few things that helped for me. One, um, you know, I eventually got actually a coach who could help me with some things. I think in particular, often tied to coaching, and we even do this at Hustle Fund informally ourselves, is we do a lot of feedback and anonymous feedback and anonymous 360s to try to get a sense of, get a pulse of how everyone is feeling. That feedback can be really hard to take, but over time it's like, okay, I understand these are my weaknesses. These are the things that I want to work on. And that just helps you become like a better leader. It's so funny, at a former employer, they brought in this third party coach and asked a question in front of everybody. We had a team meeting. He gave everyone a Post-it and asked everybody to go up to the wall and put the Post-it on the scale of how they were feeling about the company. And it was essentially on one end, it was like, we think this company is doing great. And the other end is, we think this company is doing horribly. And everybody who is on the team, not in an executive role, pretty much posted on the, we don't think this is going so well side of things. And all the executives posted on the, we think this is going great side of things. And it was just a classic elimination of like, the leadership is so clueless about what the team actually thinks. And the team really isn't going to tell you to your face because you're the boss. And so that, I think, is something to be very cognizant of. So how do you kind of tease that out and keep morale high? I would say that's probably the number one thing I've learned over the years.
And when you were considering bringing on a coach, I guess an executive coach, what were some of the things that you were hoping to get from that experience?
Honestly, we ended up doing that because things were so horrible that it was pretty far gone. So I was just hoping that the coach could kind of help us fix team morale. But I would actually do that earlier than later as a preventative thing now. And I think sort of the right time to do that is, because I understand like often companies don't have any money when you first start, but maybe a good time to do that is when you raise like a what I would call a post-seed round. So maybe a tinge pre-A. So you have a little bit of money to be able to do this. And you don't have to work with the coach all the time. Those coaches can be very expensive, but just sort of maybe it's like an hour a month even, just to start that relationship and start thinking about things in a certain way. And then after you raise the A, I would certainly have at least the co-founders do coaching somewhat regularly, like once every 2 weeks or so, because I do think that is for the right coach. I think that's an investment rather than a cost.
And what are some of the things that you found were I don't know, but after you got your coach, how did you begin doing things differently? Like what are some of the things that coaches can help you with? What's the scope of what they can help with?
Yeah, it depends a little bit on the coach, but one of the things that my coach helped with was he came in and he asked us, so what are your mission and values for this company? And immediately my thought was, oh, this is so floofy. Like, why did we bring this guy on? But I'll give you an example of how this was incredibly helpful. Like when we were setting our values, when I was setting my values with my co-founder, it's an interesting exercise because you have in your mind a list of things that are important to you. Those things may or may not be important to your co-founder. And moreover, they may not be in the same sort of stack rank order. And so it's, my coach said, all right, after we had sort of consolidated this list of things of our values that we agreed upon, and in the order that we agreed upon them, like in terms of most important to sort of least important, like a handful of values, he said, all right, like the next time that you get into a dispute about something, it doesn't matter like how big or small it is, use those values to do the arguing. So for example, if you're saying, I think that we should go and build this feature, it's not just like, oh, I think this and you think that. It's more of, because we value innovation here a lot, like we should build this feature or whatever. So kind of using that as like a third party board to argue on.
Makes sense. And kind of looking beyond coaching, are there any mentors that you found critical to your transition from the corporate world to the world of entrepreneurship?
Yeah, I've had a few mentors along the way, people who, had built startups before, so who were ahead of me in this journey. And I think it is actually great. I don't think they have to be formalized mentors. I think people often ask for like a formal mentor, and it's kind of unclear what that means. Are they a formal advisor to the company, or are they like, what does that mean? But I think that there is sort of a handful of people whom I go to whenever I have a question about something where it's like, oh, I haven't faced this before. I've not fired anybody before and I have to fire this person. Like, what do I do? Kind of thing. So I certainly had a handful. I think a couple more notable people might be like um, David Hauser, who was one of the co-founders of this company called the Grasshopper Group, which was like a virtual phone system, and that was entirely bootstrapped. So he certainly has a purview on that, and what he thinks about VCs. And then another person whom I think is also fairly notable, like this guy named Andrew Chen, who's now a general partner at A16Z. Like they were incredible sounding boards to me through my ad startup journey for sure.
And how did you find these mentors?
Actually, I think that in this day and age, which is different from when I was around, but I think in this day and age, actually, again, Twitter is a big place where you can build relationships. And actually, I first met Andrew on Twitter. He happened to live in the Bay Area as I did, and so we ended up meeting up and stuff like that. And so that's how I got to know him better. But I think in this day and age, you can build those relationships entirely on Twitter, never having met them in person before. And then same with David. Not on Twitter, but I met him through a couple of friends who knew him. And I would say that with him, like I've largely just asked him questions over email over the years.
Let's see. So turning or changing topics a little bit, what advice do you have for first-time female angel investors? This person says that they're about to join a fund and they're one of only a few women.
I think as a clarification question, like, is this in like how to invest your own money or how to work at a fund?
Yeah, I'm not sure. Maybe we should go with the former.
Okay. So with your own money, so actually big props to you. I think there need to be more women investors. I have found just in my own friend group, comparing and contrasting like my male and female friends, like who have, relatively the same amounts of wealth and positions at their companies. My male friends tend to be way more aggressive on their angel investing than my female friends. So a big props to you. I think that my advice can be boiled down pretty simply. Start small. It was a surprise to me to learn there are a lot of angel investors just like literally running around writing $1,000 checks. In my mind, I thought to become an angel investor, you needed to be writing like $25,000 checks, and therefore you need a lot of money because you wouldn't just write one. But I think I would start small, like $1,000 checks, maybe $5,000 checks. And I would aim for a portfolio of about 50 or so, not right away, but like over the years. So if it's 10 years, then maybe you're investing in 5 companies a year. And so maybe you put aside $5,000 every year to start. That's what I would recommend. So that way you have a large enough portfolio to be able to make mistakes, because you're going to make a lot of mistakes. But that diversification is really helpful. Like that honestly is one of the best ways to make money consistently. And so in order to do so, you need to start with small checks. And I think the second thing I would advise is after you write the check, or in process of writing the check, like tell the founder, hey, I would, love to be a little bit active in the beginning. I'm happy to help you, with your deck or give you feedback on your website or something like that. That will give you a few more touch points with the entrepreneur to really understand what it is you're investing in and how they think or whatever, because that will help you get some feedback around, okay, did I make a mistake or not? Because you won't actually know your results for, call it 10 years. That feedback loop is too long. And so how do you get like a tighter feedback loop to be able to learn? Well, I would work to the extent possible, work with the founders for a few hours to try to shift your mental model of how you would invest better the next time.
That's really good advice. And this question also kind of, we're changing tacks a little bit. Do you have any best practices or solutions for dealing with coworkers or bosses who don't take you seriously, possibly because you're a younger woman, but for whatever reason?
I think I don't have a whole lot of context on this question, but I would try to dig into that a bit. Like, I mean, I think that Sometimes it's easy to be a little bit timid about asking direct questions. But as an example, if let's say a coworker or your boss kind of brushes you off, like maybe you push on that a little bit, which is like, oh, hey, I would just love some feedback here. It seems like you're not really that interested in whatever I just said. Curious, curious why, and then see what comes back. And maybe you'll learn something about whatever it is. Or maybe you'll also learn that actually they're just very dismissive people of you and they don't make sense at all. And then I would question whether you're working at the right place. And maybe the better move is to start figuring out your exit plan from this company. So that would be my thought on that.
When you think back on your career thus far, and going from maybe working for someone else to now kind of striking out on your own multiple times, how did you do that? How did you unlock that potential to do something and create something completely new?
I think now that I'm years into this, I can't imagine ever going to work for somebody else again. But I do agree it's very scary in the beginning. Remember, I left my nice job in the middle of the recession and didn't know what I was doing. And to have full faith in myself that I could make things work. And there were many days where I felt like I do not know how I'm going to make things work. But I mean, I think the attitude that I would go into it for anyone who is interested in like leaving your job to take the plunge is like, one, be prepared. So, have some savings. I had 2 years saved up. I had really scrimped while all of my Google colleagues were like blowing money left and right. Like I lived with my parents and stuff like that. So have some cushion. Don't just like jump in. And then the other thing is like, you're not going to be great at things like day one. So just, see it as a learning game. Like, how can I learn and get better every day? And I don't really have a good way to measure that, but don't be too hard on yourself. You're not going to see results tomorrow as soon as you jump ship. Like, I didn't know anything, so I'm going to try to figure things out, like, just very consistently every day. And then the last piece is, I think that you can take solace in the fact that if it doesn't work out, you can always go and work for somebody else again. I think especially in this market where labor is getting tighter and tighter, you will be able to find a job again. It may not be the job that you love, but you will be able to find a job again. And so, it's like the worst case scenario is it doesn't work out and you end up in another job that you didn't really like. But, how different is that from this job you're thinking about leaving anyway?
And in another talk that you gave, you shared about how you ended up in your first job in Japan and how you applied for an MBA program. You said something powerful about the interplay of success and failure. Could you maybe share that story with us and what you meant by that?
Yeah. So this is kind of what I alluded to earlier when you asked me about the MBA, because the short version of this story is my senior year of college, I thought I wanted to go to business school. So I applied to all these schools, and I was on the West Coast, but I wanted to fly to see some schools in Boston, and I didn't want to pay for my plane ticket and travel and all that. So I applied for this contest, and the prize was a free trip to Boston. And so I went to Boston, and then I had to get my reimbursement. And in order to do that, you had to go to this job fair, which is sponsoring the contest, for 2 days. So I went there in order to get my reimbursement. I saw the schools I wanted to apply to in Boston. And at the job fair, I got a job, and it was for a job in Japan. I didn't get into any business school, but I did have that job. So I took that job. And then a month into it, my boss pulled me aside and said, "Your Japanese is not very good. We can't keep you here." And so I was like, "Oh my gosh, I'm getting fired from my very first job here." I was actually pretty distraught. But anyway, long story short, I was like, okay, I guess I don't have a job, so I need to figure something out. And I decided I liked one school in Boston. And so I reapplied to that one school, sent in the same application, same test score, same, letters of recommendation. The only thing was different was one question, which was, what have you done in the last year? I was like, well, let me tell you about this job. And so anyway, and I got in. And so I was like, okay, what just happened here? I failed to get into business school. So I got this job, but then I failed to keep the job. And so I got into business school. So that was kind of my story with that. So it's just, you never know like how close you are to success or failure. They're fairly interlocked. And if you are doing one thing, it means you cannot be doing something else. So when a door closes and a window opens, or whatever the saying is, like that really is true. You don't actually know whether, it's a good or a bad thing when doors and windows close and open all the time.
And looking ahead for the next 3 to 5 years, what will we find you doing?
I'll still be working on Hustle Fund for the next 30 or 26 at this point.
And then maybe finally, do you have any book recommendations for us?
Oh, wow. I have so many, but, if you want a book to sort of uplift morale, I really like The Hard Thing About Hard Things by, I'm blanking, by Horowitz, but what's his first name? Ben Horowitz from A16Z. Like, everything that can go wrong happen in a company happens to him, and he talks about it. And it's just an incredible story of ups and downs, and mostly downs. I think the TLDR that many people are familiar with is that he ended up selling his company to HP for over $1 billion. But it was a hard journey, and this book really illustrates it. So if you ever want to feel good about yourself, like your fundraising process is not going well, or your team is not doing well, or you're out of money like a bajillion times, like that book is like 10 times whatever you're going through.
So The Hard Thing About Hard Things.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Elizabeth. This has been a fantastic conversation, and really appreciate you taking the time to answer all of our questions, and also to jumpstart our conversation about women in leadership. And thanks to everyone who's in the audience for all the great questions. Our next event will be tomorrow's panel discussion, The Good, the Bad, and the Future, with 3 Quantic women, and moderated by Dr. Lisa Belanger. And it starts at 9:30 a.m. Eastern Time. So see you all there, and thank you so much.